In this module, we are going to discuss about the democracy building in India, the way democratic career of India has taken shape, and what have been the challenges for India's democracy, and whether Indian democracy has been successful or not so successful. So we would have a kind of a appraisal report about the career of democratic career of independent India. Students, you must be aware that the democracy is the end thing. You know, in the post-Soviet world, there has been so much emphasis on democratic transformation and democratic consolidation all over the world. Whether it's a World Bank, it's a International Monetary Fund, it's like a global funding agencies. There has been, and also with the rise of the liberal political theory and the decline of Marxian ideology with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the erstwhile East European communist countries, there has been a lot of emphasis on having democracy and having a democratic roots. And India stands out as one of the successful case study of democracy. India, of course, is a new democracy, but India has had uninterrupted history of democratic regime in the world, and which is very rare because most of the countries, Asian, African, and Latin American countries, which became independent after Second World War, they could not remain democracy for all these periods. There have been very few countries, I can think of Guinea-Bissau and Ghana and some other countries, which have been successful in having a longer term of democracy. So Indian democracy comes out as a successful story, and in India we have, with the exception of those 2 years of emergency period between 1975 to 1977, India has really remained a successful political democracy and electoral democracy. And India has been a successful democracy because if we consider democracy in its procedural form, we think about the presence of more than one party, we think about a high level of political participation, we also think about the free press, we think about the parliament, we think about the independent judiciary, we think about a rational professional bureaucracy. So all these factors, you think about the ingredients of a marker or signifiers of a successful democracy, political democracy. India fulfills all those criteria, which has been very remarkable because if you consider the ground reality in India, India lacks many of the ingredients which are supposed to be essential for the success of democracy anywhere in the world if you refer to the Western literature. So we discuss about, when we think about democracy, as I said, that India stands out as the world's largest democracy, and you just consider the territory and the population. India is 7th largest country in terms of the area. India is the second most populous country in the world after China, and China is not a liberal democracy. It calls itself a people's democracy, but you know, they don't have a multi-party system and a free and fair elections and free and fair press, which are very essential ingredient for a successful democracy. Indian democracy defies many prevailing theories, academic wisdom about the success of democracy. And there you can think of many factors which are considered as very essential for the success of democracy. One is the income. Income is a great predictor of the success of democracy. All over the world, the countries which have had a fair degree of economic prosperity, there the democracy has had a better chance of succeeding. But of course, there are exceptions also, like the countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, which have had a fairly successful experience in the economic arena. They have not been really a truly liberal democracy. Whereas India, a poor country, one can call India kind of a lower middle income country. But despite so much poverty and all, Indian democracy has been successful. So that way, India defies the conventional wisdom. There are other ingredients also, like the very high level of literacy. I mean, it's considered good. You also think of a middle class, you think of a democratic neighborhood, you think about a kind of industrial development. So when India started its democratic journey, probably India was lacking on all those terms. There was also this hierarchical society and patriarchal society. So all those factors were there which were not really considered very conducive for the success of democracy. One can also think about the role of the religion, the religious divide, which basically led to the partition of India and communalism, which continued to prevail. Here you must understand that kind of communal divide, they are all India kind of divide. They are not confined to a territorial area. They are not confined to a particular region. So when you talk about Hindu-Muslim divide, that's an all India divide. When you talk about the minority-majority question, that's an all India question. So you can, I mean, most of the identities, if you think about the caste-based identity or the linguistic identity, the tribal identities, they are territorially confined, and that's why it's much easier to tackle them, much easier to deal with them for the Indian state. But when it comes to the communal divide, when it comes to the all India divide, then it becomes very difficult. They become threatening to the success of democracy, stability of a democratic, peaceful society. So that has been also a great problem, a challenge to India's democracy. And also, if you think in terms of the primary sector like health, education, employment, India has had a great problem right from the beginning, which has been a kind of a ever-increasing population and the need to feed the people, need to fulfill the economic necessities of the people. That has been always a great challenge to the democratic rulers of India. We also have a problem of political dynasty. See, for many, many years, in fact, from 1947 to 1989, 1985, and with the exception of 1977 to 1979, those 2 years. And then after 1989, almost like 1947 to 1989, almost 42 years, with the exception of those 2 years, 77 to 79, India was ruled by one party, and that was the Congress party. And from 1947 to 1967 period has been characterized by Rajni Kothari as the Congress system, when the Congress ruled, Congress acted not only as a ruling party but also as a kind of a party of opposition, whereas the opposition parties which were fragmented, which were divided, badly divided, they acted as a pressure groups. And then you also talked about dynasty, because it has been the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty which has really ruled over most part of India's independence even now. So with the exception of, say, Narasimha Rao being the prime minister, or say now you have Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Narendra Modi and all, the NDA regime. Otherwise, it has been the Congress party in power and the Nehru-Gandhi family at the helm of the affairs, which has been another challenge. Dynasty politics is not confined at the center, is not confined to the Congress party. As we see that many parties which claim to be democratic parties, they do not have a democratic structure. They all follow the dynastic politics with few exceptions, like the left parties or BJP. Most of the parties, and especially the state level parties, the community based parties, which cater to which call themselves the social justice parties. Now, when we talk about the democratic effect of India, one can always say that one of the success of India's democracy, as Sunil Chilani argues, is that the idea of democracy has now got embedded in the popular consciousness of the people. So democracy may not be working on the ground in a true sense of the word, but democracy as an idea, the democratic ideals like equality, the principle of equality, principle of justice, fraternity, they all are there. I mean, in the survey after survey, I can refer to the CSDS survey also. It has been found out that most of the Indians, overwhelming number of the Indians, do not think in terms of any alternative other than democracy. So that's something which is really success of India's democracy, that despite widespread illiteracy, corruption, population explosion, environmental damages, all those factors, the benefits of the development not reaching to the common people, we can still say that Indian democracy has penetrated the social order, the kind of untouchability, the practices of untouchability, practices of caste-based discrimination, the humiliations which persisted for centuries now are simply not there. So that has been the success of India's democracy. We can also think of like the causes of democratization. We can see that there has been a development on the educational front, and there has been a kind of a rise of a middle class, and India has one of the fastest growing segment of the middle class. India has, I think one can argue that India is one of a few countries, top 3, top 5 countries, maybe China, maybe US has a larger middle class population than India. And by some Deutsche Bank and other foreign banks calculation and the economist calculation, you can refer to Varshney, you can refer to Pranab Burdhan. There are people who have written about middle classes, and they have argued that almost say Surjit Bhalla is also another name which comes to my mind. They have argued that 25 to 30% people, they belong to the middle class. Of course, middle class is not the kind of homogeneous or singular middle class. We always talk in a plural sense, middle classes. So you have middle class, you have upper middle class, you have a lower middle class. But then the middle class as a segment has been on increase, and one can argue that this class has become the career of democratization process, democratic consolidation process in India, because this class has been a great votary of liberal democracy accompanied by a market economy. And India also has a vibrant civil society. We have NGOs, we have trade unions, we have academia, we have universities as the signpost of democracy, and we also have the human rights organizations and a free press, very vibrant press. So that has also been a very important factor. We all have developed a kind of civic culture which is based on participation and which is based on the political awareness among the people, thanks to the media, thanks to independent media, social media, explosion of technology. All these factors have really played very important role in inculcating the values of democracy among the people. We can also refer that there has been, of course, the diversity was always considered as a kind of anathema to the success of democracy, and India has been one of the most diverse countries in the world. But there has been an attempt to accommodate the diversities and to inculcate a feeling of unity among the people by recognizing those linguistic differences. For example, you have the constitutional recognition of the languages. We also have many affirmative policies which are targeting the socially and the economically marginal groups, and then we have the special rights for the minorities. So all those factors have really helped India to remain a successful democracy. Even our democratic configuration, India being largely a young country, 65% of the Indians below 35 years of age, which is a great thing because the young people, the young generation of India, basically they have grown up in India which has been greatly democratized, and there has been such a great upsurge from below, the right to vote given to everyone. This has really helped India's democracy great way. And then the role of the social movements, the reformist movements, and the electoral process, the voting, universal franchise, and the emergence of the different parties which really recognizes and think about the smaller identities, even the most backward caste, like the artisan communities and all. That has really helped. And now you can see that even the national parties are recognizing and giving representation to the minority communities and giving representation to these smaller identity groups, smaller economic categories, and that has really helped in the democratization process. Now, when we talk about the democratization process, we have this Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential work, The End of the History and the Last Man. And in that book, he said that there has been an expansion of the liberal economic reforms, and probably he also predicted that the world would be truly become a liberal democratic world and there would not be any alternative to liberal democracy. Samuel Huntington is another very influential liberal philosopher and the liberal academic who has written about the third wave, and in that book also Huntington has talked about the three waves of democratization. The first wave brought democracy to the Western Europe and the Northern America in the 19th century. The second wave was after, as I said, the second wave came after Second World War, when many Asian, African and Latin American countries which were colonies, they went on to become democracy after liberation. In fact, their liberation movement also aimed at establishment of democratic regimes. And that's another matter, that these democratic regimes, with few exceptions, India is one of a most notable exception, that most of these countries did not remain democratic. Then the third wave, which starts with the 1974 or something, as Huntington says, that democratization first took place in Latin America and then it swept the whole world. And now, after the collapse of Soviet Union, you had also the Velvet Revolution, when the many erstwhile East European countries, they became, they started their democratic transformation journey. So then most recently you have had this Arab world, the Arab Spring, which has been called, like, starting from Egypt and spreading to many other countries in favor of democracy, and the Western countries also interfering in the affair and trying to bring a democratic change. And of course, this process has not been very successful. But then there has been a talk about democratic promotion. One can also refer to Fareed Zakaria work, which also talks about that how the poverty has led to the rise of terrorism in the countries of the Middle East, and how the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and all, they have put a challenge to the idea of democratic consolidation, democratic transformation, or arrival of democracies in the erstwhile authoritarian regimes like Libya or Syria or say like Iraq. So that has been also a problem. Ethnic strife that is there, like Kurdish problem and the Shia Sunni and all those kind of, like most recently the Myanmar, then you had Sri Lanka. So ethnic conflict, the interracial conflict, interreligious conflict, intra-religious conflict, they all have really put a question mark about this third wave of democratization, which Huntington talked about, that how far it is going to be successful. Even the East Bloc countries, the erstwhile East European countries, they are having problem with their democratic consolidation. Now, when we refer to democratic consolidation, what do we talk about? We talk about judicial reform, we talk about abolition of poverty, we talk about introduction of the mechanism of direct democracy or the grassroots democracy, we talk about civilian supremacy over military, we also talked about the diffusion of the democratic values among the people, we talked about the rise of the democratic parties and truly electoral contests. We talked about independent constitutional bodies to hold the free and fair elections. We also talked about party building. We talked about the organization of the functional interest, the economic interest groups emerging. So all those factors are considered as a signifier of, we need a kind of a financial stability, judicial reform, institutional reforms. We need a kind of whole superstructure of democratic institutions, and they should be working well. Only then we can say, as Robert Dahl talked about, contestation and participation. So they are very much needed in order to consolidate India's democracy. And there we have to consider the fact that Indian democracy, on all those parameters, whether we talked about the presence of the independent constitutional bodies, we talked about the rights regime, we talked about independence of the judiciary, we talked about the civil society movements, we talked about the civil society groups, social action groups, and the activists. We can say that Indian democracy has not really performed badly. Indian democracy has done well. we can think about certain challenges which continue to be there. As I said at the outset, if the communal divide was the challenge at the time of partition, at the time of decolonization in India, it has remained a challenge even now. We also talked about the spatial disparity and the disparity among the classes, how the rich are becoming richer, whereas poor are not becoming poorer, but they are not really catching up with the rich people. And we have a huge middle class, but a major segment of the middle class really belongs to lower middle class. They are at the threshold, so they are not poor, but they are not really truly middle class. They can anytime revert back to the poor class. And then we have extremely poor people, almost like 1/3 of India's population, though poverty level is going down. But even now, almost 1/3 of India's population live below the poverty line. India has one of the largest population of the poor. And the poverty does not really goes away, despite the fact that all the parties which have come to power, they have promised to mitigate poverty, but the poverty remains very high. We also can think about the inadequate participation of the women. We can think about the inadequate representation of the women in the lawmaking bodies, in the public services, and the same is true for the minorities also, the religious minorities also. So these are the factors which are really the economic development. Also, one can also argue that India should have developed at a faster rate, because India and China were almost at the same level in the 60s. India was ahead, in fact, of many Southeast Asian countries which are now known as Asian tigers. But India has had a very steady but a very inadequate growth rate all these years, and which has hit India's democracy in the sense that we did not have much resources to attack poverty, to ensure that the per capita income increases. And that there has been a problem also, as I said, the problem of redistribution of the resources. The democratic promises, the seductive democratic promise for having a kind of egalitarian development, for developing the regions and developing the different parts of the country and the different classes of the people, that has not really succeeded much. And so there is a kind of vicious circle of permanent poverty and political exclusion and massive health issue in India. Of late, and as I'm saying, that every government has come to power promising to do something about the primary sector, to do something about health, education. But the fact is that in India, we have almost 1/4 population which remains illiterate. We also have a very poor educational and health facilities in the public sector, which is very much needed given the large number of the poor people in India. So these are the problems. Like you can think about the child and women, you think about the UNO, this GDI, the Gender Development Index, you talk about Human Development Index. India fares very poorly in those terms. So income has increased, the GNP has increased, the export has increased. India has been one of the fastest growing economy in the world. But in reality, the benefits have not really reached to the common people to the extent it should have reached. India has done well in terms of economic growth, but in terms of development, Indian democracy has been found wanting, and probably development is more important also for democratic consolidation, because how can you root democracy? How can you make a democracy if democracy is not all inclusive? If the democracy only invites people to vote, or it only ensures the political rights but does not do much about the economic rights or the economic justice. And so there is problem about this, what you can say, democratic superficiality, that on the surface it looks like India being a great democracy. When we think in terms of the number of the voters, we think in terms of the number of the parties, but actually one can ask what happens in between the period, between the one election and another election, how the policies are being really implemented, or they are not being implemented, the policies which are promised at the time of election, and to what extent the substantive issues appear on the political agenda of the parties when they interact with the people, common people. So that way we can say that Indian democracy has been kind of has had a mixed record. Of course, we cannot really think of reverting back to any other regime. India is here going to stay as a democratic regime. There is no chance of, there is no possibility really about the democratic failure, but there are democratic deficits which need to be addressed. In fact, in India, we can say that all right, all those problems have not been, all those issues have not been tackled, the important issues for the success of democracy. But even then, India is a democracy, and of course one can argue that India can become a better democracy. India can become a better democracy, and remember, no democracy in the world is a perfect democracy. Even Athenian democracy was not a perfect democracy. So there is always a possibility of improvement. There is always a possibility of democratic consolidation. So yes, India needs the continuation of the process of democratic consolidation so that India becomes a truly social, economic and political democracy, as was thought about, as was the vision of our constitution makers, as was the vision of our nationalist movements, because nationalist movement was not only about gaining freedom from the British, it was also gaining the economic and social freedom. It was also about achieving the kind of emancipation for all the people, as Gandhiji used to say, Daridra Narayan. So the needs of the last person, the demands of the last person in the queue should be fulfilled. Only then we can say that India's democracy has succeeded. It's a mammoth task given the scale of the challenges, given the population, given the territory, given the diversity, but nevertheless, Indian democracy is on the right way, the right path. And of course, as I said again and again in this presentation, that Indian democracy can always become a better democracy. Thank you very much.